Pleasure in the diverse cultures of the upper class, a cultural historical essay. Pleasure, a seemingly universal human need that spans all social classes, reveals when observed within the upper class a remarkable richness of expressions, meanings, and performances. Few other concepts bridge the material and the symbolic, the everyday and the exclusive, the physical and the intellectual, with such elegance. When tracing the history of pleasure across various upper-class cultures, from ancient courts to the digital elites of today, one finds that pleasure has never merely been a matter of taste. It has always been a marker of status, education, distinction, and often power. This essay explores pleasure as a cultural practice among upper classes across continents and centuries, through feasts, theaters, temples, gardens, and screens, across opulence and asceticism, refinement and decadence. In antiquity, the aristocracy's relationship with pleasure was one of cultivation and ritual. In ancient Greece, pleasure among the elite was not merely tolerated, it was philosophically justified. The symposium, a formal drinking party among aristocrats, was a space for wine, poetry, music, games, and conversation. Pleasure here was structured and stylized, but also restricted. Women were often excluded, and slaves served the guests. Pleasure was not just about sensuality, it was a sign of culture, reason, and social superiority. Similarly, in ancient Rome, patricians held extravagant banquets where wealth, taste, and exoticism were displayed. Simultaneously, philosophers such as Seneca warned of indulgence and advocated for moderation. Thus, pleasure became both an experience and a matter of ethical reflection. The medieval period in Europe brought a shift. Within the Christian feudal hierarchy, especially among nobility and clergy, pleasure lived in a tension between worldly luxury and spiritual asceticism. While noble courts hosted lavish festivals with game meat, music, tournaments, and wine, religious figures preached the dangers of lust and gluttony. Yet this tension gave rise to refined practices. Monasteries became centers of culinary innovation. Nobles developed sophisticated table manners. Courtly love elevated erotic desire into poetic longing. In the Islamic world, meanwhile, pleasure was codified differently. The upper classes of Cordoba, Baghdad, and Samarkand fostered sensuous cultures of perfume, cuisine, music, and erotic literature, within a framework of religious guidance. Pleasure was permissible, even encouraged, as long as it respected balance and spiritual purpose. The Renaissance recentered the individual, and with them, the senses. In princely courts like that of the Medici in Florence, aesthetic pleasure became a life principle. Art, architecture, cuisine, and music converged into a Gesamtkunstwerk of elite life. Pleasure became not just about having, but about knowing. A painting, a poem, a garden, these were enjoyed by the elite, not only through the senses, but through cultivated interpretation. With the Enlightenment, pleasure expanded further into the educated bourgeoisie. The emerging middle and upper middle classes sought to emulate aristocratic tastes, while reinterpreting them through the lens of reason. Tea ceremonies, salons, chamber music, and philosophical discourse became central. Pleasure turned intellectual. At the same time, colonialism introduced global dimensions of pleasure. European elites didn't merely import spices, tobacco, coffee, tea, and silk. They also absorbed and redefined lifestyles, images, and fantasies. Colonial pleasure was often ambiguous, exoticizing, extractive, and based on structural violence. Yet it left a deep mark on elite culture. Possessing and displaying colonial goods became a symbol of power and worldliness. In return, colonial aristocracies, for example, Indian Maharajas, maintained their own pleasure traditions and sometimes incorporated Western elements in hybrid forms. Culinary, musical, and sartorial syntheses emerged. Pleasure was thus never neutral, it always mirrored political conditions. The 20th century brought both a further refinement and democratization of elite pleasure. European and American upper classes turned toward ever more codified signs of distinction: haute cuisine, designer fashion, modern art, exclusive travel destinations. Pleasure was no longer just about money, but about cultural capital. Knowing how to pair wine and cheese, how to appreciate Schoenberg, or how to navigate Japanese etiquette became markers of elite status. Yet countercultures, from bohemian movements to punk, challenged this model. They too pursued pleasure, but as authenticity rather than exclusivity. The elite adapted by absorbing subcultural codes into their aesthetics. Pleasure became fluid, performative. In Asia, particularly Japan, upper-class pleasure took different paths. Minimalism became the essence of refinement. The tea ceremony, kaiseki cuisine, ikebana flower arrangement, and the scent of handmade paper expressed an aesthetic of silence and perfection. Pleasure here resided not in abundance, but in calibrated restraint. In China, elite pleasure was linked to Confucian and Taoist traditions. Tea drinking, calligraphy, incense, and even opium use in some contexts were seen as gateways to aesthetic and philosophical experience. Until colonial interventions turned these into destructive practices. Today's global upper class, digital, mobile, often transnational, lives in paradox. On one hand, their resources are virtually unlimited. They travel by private jets, dine on multi-course fusion meals, commission art and architecture across continents. On the other hand, pleasure is increasingly moralized. Ethics, sustainability, health, and authenticity are essential. The right taste must now be both exquisite and conscious. Organic wines accompany Chateau Mouton Rothschild. Farm-to-table cuisine coexists with Michelin stars. The modern elite distances itself from vulgar excess, not through renunciation, but through selective refinement. True distinction now lies in knowing what not to eat, where, consume, or post. Pleasure among elites has always been a social act. It's a sign of belonging, a mark of education, a method of boundary setting. Having a truffle is not enough. Knowing when, how, and with whom to enjoy it matters more. In Arab upper classes, hospitality is a key pleasure form. Generous, courteous, performative, yet structured. In traditional African aristocracies, such as the Yoruba, pleasure involved dance, music, clothing, and food as parts of spiritual and communal rituals. In South America, elite pleasure emerged through community. The asado in Argentina, samba in Brazil, sharing mate in groups, all delivered with understated elegance. In Russia, from czars to oligarchs, pleasure has often been a combination of cold and opulence. Caviar, crystal, melancholy. Gender also plays a central role. Historically, elite pleasure was a male privilege. Women were often excluded or objectified within pleasure systems. Only with the rise of educated women in salons, universities, and later public life did female pleasure cultures emerge. In literature, travel, fashion, sexuality. Today, pleasure remains a gendered field, with disparities, expectations, and codes shaping who enjoys, how, and with what recognition. Pleasure is never innocent. It can be a form of empowerment or distraction, of freedom or control. Elites have used it as both. While some express beauty, worldliness, and responsibility through pleasure, others use it to display detachment, exclusion, or excess. This raises a pressing question. How can pleasure be reimagined in a world marked by inequality, crisis, and fragmentation? Perhaps the future of elite pleasure lies not in exclusivity, but in generosity. Not in excess, but in the art of sharing. In returning to the root of the word pleasure, from Latin gaudium, meaning joy. A joy that multiplies when shared, a practice that celebrates not only itself, but life itself. If tomorrow's elites manage to connect refinement with responsibility, distinction with empathy, then pleasure could once again become what it sometimes was, a subtle, powerful sign of culture.